Alright everyone, welcome to another Witch on the Holy Night. This is what I want to call like the grace period chapter, considering after all that's happened between the first two, the previous two that is, because it was all non-stop action and we're finally here with the whole, I like to call it the breather, if you will. So if anything else guys, we're going to continue on from there. Hope you all continue to enjoy. Thank you all for the love and support. Now let's do this. Alright everyone, and we're back. Closer to empty air than a human being. It was about as heavy as one would expect if they bottled the summer breeze. Thought that didn't fit her image of Sojiro perfectly.
アリスの言う通り。
She muttered to no one in particular as she recalled the past.
ほんと、私らしくない。
Aoko wore a bittersweet smile. Her usual moodiness was gone. It was a dangerous world out there. It was good to have someone to keep her on her toes. With a wry chuckle, she flicked the magical bottle with her finger and set off walking. She could hear a bell in the distance, signaling the end of the play. An ephemeral dream gave way to reality. In the grand scheme of things, it had been but an instant. As the actors exited stage left, the last of the lights silently flickered out. And so the long-dead amusement park played its final role as a memory for a boy and a girl. Farewell, Kitsyland. Like a dog. He was still in a deep sleep. It all seemed ablaze in a mad, fiery red. Unbearable idle thoughts. Incessant obstinacy. Melancholy sights and gloomy bittersweet talk. Fickle wickedness born of human interaction. Namely, the voice of a forsaken coexistence. This, however, was the scenery of a world far removed from that. If there were those praying this was paradise, then there are likely also those lamenting it as the underworld. In a decade, or perhaps longer, this would all change, but for now, the autumn leaves remained yet untrampled by human souls. It was scenery he knew well. Life in the mountains was humble and modest. There were no conspicuous buildings among this wilderness he called home. They gathered and stockpiled only what they needed to survive without pillaging the land. Serpentine trails could be seen woven through the fields, and the stone steps leading to the summit were obscured by the forest, only visible once upon them. The mountain inhabitants probably intended it that way. There was no sign of mankind's exploitation among the mountain landscape. He suddenly remembered that this was the season he liked the most. Or rather, it suited him the most. There was much to be done to prepare for the winter, but whenever he had a free moment, he would make his way toward the mountaintop. Gazing idly at the setting sun while breathing deep the crisp autumn air was probably the second favorite of his daily joys. It relaxed him, the cold but comforting wind at dusk, and the way the sunset dyed the peaks a vibrant crimson. Not 2 months had passed since coming down from the mountains, and already it pained him that the memories had begun to fade. Someone once told him that memories fade every day, so the best one could do is make as many new ones as possible. Recollections grew hazy. A new place to live meant the beginning of a new life. He wasn't sure if he was reluctant to let go of the scenery he had cherished for so long, or if he'd merely been spoiled by it. Despite his new home in a city surrounded by tall buildings, he felt guilty for wanting those memories alone to remain clear in his mind. Either way, he had to make the best of a fresh start. What kind of man thinks more about where he came from than where he's going, he contemplated.
そうか。これ 夢だ。
He tried to stop himself from indulging in uncharacteristic sentimentality. It wouldn't be a dream if it was easy to understand. The moment he realized he was dreaming, angular shadows began to rise from the autumn colors. They were concrete buildings previously unknown and yet familiar to him at the same time. This was how his current life was washing away his memories. Struggle as he might, there was no stopping the degradation of human memory or impressions. It was merely a fact of life. By nature, humans lived in the present over the past. Eventually, even his most cherished memories would be swallowed up by buildings. It was neither cruel nor heartless. If they were sure to disappear, then, for now, he would content himself with dreaming about the memories he could clearly recall. Whether in the mountains or the city, the days flew by. Yesterday's scenery was not the same as today's. And such. She had given him no time to grieve. Distant nostalgia was beautiful, but that made it fleeting.
土産入道じゃないんだぞ、青崎。
A faint dizziness made him close his eyes. Without sight, the mountainous landscape vanished, but in its place, a familiar voice could be heard. It was a booming voice that seemed to shake not only the mountainside he stood upon, but the entire mountain as well. And of course, Aoko Aozaki reappeared towering in the distance. He must have been tired, he thought, diagnosing himself while trying to make out what she was saying. Fearing the vertigo would return if he reopened his eyes, he decided to keep them closed. It sounded like she was arguing with someone, though the tone was all he could make out. It wasn't violent, but certainly aggressive. Maybe she was picking a fight with another mountain across the way. He wouldn't put it past her. After all, she was a troublemaker who blew up the moon. He couldn't quite grasp the conversation, though somehow, vaguely, he had the sense that his human rights were being largely ignored. It was deeply unsettling even for a dream. After several minutes, it seemed that the high-impact argument ended in Aoko's victory. Then suddenly, the boisterous voice faded. Praying everything would be back to normal, he opened his eyes. He took a deep, slow breath. The scenery was a far cry from the nostalgic dreamscape he had just left, albeit not unpleasant either. Without a doubt, it was the amusement park. To him, his was his freshest memory. He recalled the house of mirrors that Aoko Aozaki destroyed. This park was a flawless replica of reality, but he was the only one there. Without having to worry about anyone chasing him, he sat down on the wreckage of Kitsy's rides and looked up at the moon that should have been shot down. The winter moon shone white like a jewel. It was layered over the figure of the girl who tried to kill him. If a mage was a witch, then she definitely fit the bill. I don't mind being killed. Such an absurd thing to say, but it spilled out of him so naturally.
いや、でも。
That had nothing to do with the witches or magecraft. There was an echo in the gaps of his heart. If she had not spoken those words, then he would not have responded as he did. In that moment, what had Aoko Aozaki said to him? As he tried to remember, his deep slumber drew to an end. And with it, his chance to find the answers he so wished he could find. Then, Sojiro woke up in an unfamiliar room, gasping. Not because the plush mattress he was on was softer than his apartment's cheap futon, or because everything from the carpet to the wallpaper looked expensive. Bewildered, he tried to catch his breath. She was the cause of his surprise. The moment Sojiro's eyes snapped open, there she was, the girl dressed in black sitting at his bedside. The silence was deafening. Still supine on the bed, Sojiro gazed at her. His impulse was to sit up, but he refrained, thinking it might be rude to be staring at the person sitting next to him. She was just sitting there on a chair, dressed in black, modest clothes. Still, she projected an air that was anything but plain. Her monochrome outfit evoked indescribable elegance, like a costume handmade just for her, from the finest fabrics. It was enough to inspire poetic sentiments even in Sojiro. The girl continued to sit completely motionless. Without realizing it, Sojiro had stopped breathing. Genuine astonishment had him captivated. Such beauty. It was the first time he had ever thought to use such a simple, plain expression to describe another human being. She was the daffodil in perfect bloom, or the ideal female form seen only in dreams. This quality was something to be cherished and admired in her. It was different from Aoko Aozaki's blindingly radiant vitality. After all, the flame that burns twice as bright burns half as long. And there was no way this girl would be allowed such a happy ending. Her life was a solitary fable of someone who left the world in exactly the same way they entered it. With her humanity stolen at birth, hers was an existence not of this world. The more beautiful something was, the more tragic its fate. Growing up in the mountains, this was not something Sojiro was taught, but something he learned from experience.
眠ってるみたいだ。
Sojiro turned his head as though he was being lured in. He knew it was rude to stare, but he couldn't fight his instincts. Then...
Eh?
This time, his heart actually skipped a beat. She was not asleep at all. Expressionless, she was merely watching over him while he recovered.
Oh.
Sojiro froze, unable to turn his head away or think of something clever to say. It was like staring into her eyes turned into stone. Perhaps because of her delicate features, she looked somewhat younger than him. On the other hand, her tranquil expression made him feel like she was older. Jet black hair just to her shoulders. Her large eyes were set like onyx stones, matching her hair. Devoid of emotion, her gaze stayed fixed on Sojiro. Even after their eyes met, she did not turn away. He wanted to speak but could not find the words. It was not unlike a frog being stared down by a snake. Nevertheless, he just could not bring himself to say something. Additionally, no matter how carefree Sojiro might have been, he was painfully aware that this girl was as powerful as Aoko. Less talkative to be sure, but still powerful. Objectively, this scene was not unlike that of someone nursing a bedridden stranger. He had no idea what she may have been thinking about, but it seemed to him this harsh silence might last forever. All he could say for sure was that the quiet did not appear to bother her in the slightest. It was like some bizarre form of punishment.
これが青崎の仕込みなら手が込みすぎる。
He thought, keeping his eyes on the girl. He felt like the moment he turned his head or blinked, she might stab him in the chest with a hidden blade. And not because his imagination was running away with him. In the stifling silence, it was only natural that Sojiro would think back on what had happened in the amusement park, and it made him uneasy. But stronger than any anxiety was his fascination with the girl. Her slender frame and milky white skin, the chill of her guarded stare, the warmth of her lingering femininity. It was the mixture of those two latter qualities that was almost magical. He stared at her for so long he began to get the feeling that they had met somewhere before. Sometime before the conflict at Kitsyland. He could not quite put his finger on it, but he was sure he had seen her previously.
その今更だけど
His voice shattered the frozen silence in the room. He almost felt sorry for making noise as he spoke out to her. But they could not very well just sit and stare at each other forever. Though he might not have been the only one thinking they were staring, and perhaps she thought they were glaring at each other.
ここはどこで君は誰だかわかるかな
She narrowed her eyes slightly, though apparently not out of offense. There was no response. Just as he was thinking it would have been better to keep quiet, she quietly raised her hand.
これ、あなたのでしょ？
Her voice was cold but melodic. A white piece of cloth was wrapped in her fingers. There was no need to tell him what it was. He was conscious enough to recognize his own possessions. Sojiro sat speechless as she tossed it to him. Picking it up, he wrapped it around his neck.
青子は、それを知っているの？
Oh, the bandages around his neck. He looked away in response to her blunt question, distracted by something unrelated. She called Aoko Aozaki by her given name, which led him to believe that the mountain Aoko had argued with in his dream was actually the girl beside him.
さあ、どうだろ
As sincerely as he could, he answered without presumption. There are things that should be known and things that need not be. There are also things that should be told and other things that must not be. Sojiro was not exactly sure what that she was referring to, however.
う。でも、その方がいいとは思うよ。
He smiled slightly at her question. Perhaps impressed by his response, the overwhelming pressure in the room dissipated noticeably. Or maybe she had been more nervous than he was the entire time, projecting the image that his room was her domain a tad too strongly. The tension faded. Sojiro tried to sit up and prop his arms beneath him. Not that they were talking, it seemed awkward to stay lying down. However, his body felt strange as he tried to move, and it surprised him how difficult it was to sit up. It took everything he had just to raise his upper body to a sitting position.
あれ、洋服のまんまだ。
As he threw the covers back, he tilted his head quizzically.
申し訳ない。こんないい布団なのに、これじゃ不釣り合いだ。というよりもったいない。
She stared at him, not expecting him to complain about not wearing pajamas while sleeping. Somehow, it appeared that he had done something to surprise her.
なんでだ。何もしてないぞ、俺。
Pouting a bit at the unwarranted curiosity, he turned to face her. Although he was still mostly laying down, it was at least a more dignified position.
それで、さっきの続きだけど。
Indeed, he needed to find out where he was and who she was before anything else. Actually, the more he thought about what happened at the amusement park, the more he got a sinking feeling in his stomach. Perhaps finally getting through to her, she calmly moved her arm from her behind her back when... Once again, they silently locked eyes. Thump, thump, thump. There was a starting sound of rapid approaching footsteps. They both had a pretty good idea of who it was.
アリス、約束！
Just as expected, Aoko Aozaki burst through the door with a thunderous roar. She entered wearing her school uniform, her long hair flowing behind her. Her breathing was heavy and her forehead was wrinkled by a scowl, granting her a demonic appearance.
アリス！
This girl named Alice scowled slightly in response. She may have even let out a sigh of disappointment slip out.
早かったわね、青子。
Her calm voice was the polar opposite of Aoko's. Needless to say, her voice dripped with a brazen coldness.
そりゃあんたの性格は知り抜いてるからね。こういう時の短絡思考はこの2年で経験済みよ。お行儀がいいようで面倒になったらあっさり投げ捨てるのがあんたでしょ。いやね、人聞きの悪い。
Effortlessly, she brushed aside Aoko's jab. In doing so, Sojiro had the distinct impression that she no longer even realized he was in the room.
はっ、それで今日まで何度煮え湯を飲まされたことか。青子に譲ると言ったけど、よく考えると面倒だから私の方で処理しておいたわ。なんて言い訳、もう聞き飽きたっつーの。短期なのはそっちの自由だけど、それなら後の始末は相方に任せるのが最低限の筋ってもんじゃないの？そうね。そうでなければ共闘している意味がないわ。
まあ今後の方針を勝手に決めた人のセリフじゃないとは思うけど。
それもきっちり型をつけたでしょ。いい？勝ったのは私たちよ。逃げ切れば見逃してあげるって言ったのは誰？言動には責任を持ちなさい、アリス。それとも何？もしかして一番気に食わないのはそのあたりの理由なわけ？
Alice frowned slightly and fell silent. Her housemate seemed to have struck a nerve that Alice herself did not know was there.
とにかくこいつの扱いはちゃんと目が覚めて本人の意思でどうするか決めるまで保留ってことで合意したでしょ。人の留守中に出し抜くのはやめてよね。
それ、青子、学校はどうしたの？まだ正午になったばかりなのに。
アリスのとこが今日で終わりって思い出して家庭の事情ってことで早退したのよ。期末試験前だってのにほんと何やってんだか。
Alko grumbled more to herself than anyone else in the room. Then she locked eyes with Alice. Or more accurately, they glared daggers at each other. The room had become tense once again, and it felt like a fight could break out any moment. With no way to escape, Sojiro had no choice but to sit and watch. But then, the electric silence that seemed like it would last forever suddenly broke about a minute later. Apparently, this sort of clash was an everyday occurrence.
私は今に言っているから、彼に事情を説明してあげて。
Alice stood up from the chair and made for the door. Watching her go, Sojiro cocked his head. In her hand was what could only be described as
果物ナイフ。
He had no other words to describe the tool she was clutching.
アリス、あえて聞くけど、その手に持ってるの何？
Aoko asked Alice as she walked past.
探検ね。どう見ても。
Alice answered expressionlessly before briskly walking out of the room.
お
Sojiro thought it best to not think too deeply about the scene he had just witnessed. At any rate, the girl in black had withdrawn, and along with her, the feeling of tension, leaving her bedridden Sojiro alone when Aoko still dressed for school. From Sojiro's perspective, this was a perfect chance to get answers to his ever-growing list of questions.
わけのわからないことだらけだ、青崎。
でしょうね。順序立てて説明してあげるからちょっと黙ってて。顔の麻痺も取れてるし呼吸も再開っと。これならもう安心かな。
She nodded, satisfied she took a seat.
どう？調子は。
なんか、だるい。
He answered meekly, dropping his shoulders. He opened and closed his left hand a few times, but moving his fingers felt slow and awkward. It was clear he was still in bad shape. Meanwhile, Aoko was blinking her eyes in wonder. Or was it admiration? Between Alice and Aoko, Sojiro did not know which of the girls was the harder to read.
体が重いのは当然よ。丸2日経ってるし、寝てるだけでも体は弱ってるだろうし。でも、もう話せるくらい回復してるとは思わなかった。あんたって見かけより頑丈にできてるのね。
ん？ 2日って？
あれからそれだけ経ってるの。学校には欠席届出しといたから、その点は安心して。ガンドの呪いもダンプティの呪いも、私とアリストで解除しといたから。
Sojiro nodded at the word curse as if recalling it suddenly. It was all coming back to him now.
どうかした？そんな遠い目しちゃって。
ああ、忘れてた。それで2日も寝込んでたのか。怖いもんだな、呪われるってことは。
ほんと緊張感ないわね、あんた。牢のように眠ってたのが嘘みたいよ。下手すると一生あのまま石膏もどきだったかもしれないのに。
ちょっと待った。今すごいこと言わなかったか？
言ったけど、聞かぬが花よ。 経緯はどうあれ、後でアリスにお礼を言っときなさい。私じゃ解除できなかったんだから。
ひどい花もあったもんだ。あ、けどアリスっていうのはさっきの子か？遊園地で俺たちを殺そうとした？
Aoko replied that it was.
彼女ずっとそこに座ってたけど、ここは彼女の部屋なのか？
Sojiro scanned the room again. He was not accustomed to sleeping on anything other than a futon, and the room looked especially foreign to him.
ここはただの客室。長いこと使ってなかったから埃だらけでしょ。それよりアリスと何か話したの？あなた。
おう、いや、あれを会話というのはちょっと。
He brought his hand to his mouth and recalled the few words they exchanged. As Sojiro said, calling it a conversation would be a gross overstatement. And yet, thinking back on it, it seemed like they had talked for hours, which brought an uncomfortable smile to his face.
とはいえ、緊張は解けたと思うよ。青崎がやってくるのがもう少し遅かったらよかったのに。
Oh, no. Aoko narrowed her eyes at his innocent slip of the tongue. She knew Sojiro did not mean to treat her like a nuisance, but nevertheless she found it hard to take the full brunt of the words said to her face. Even worse, she sensed she was getting used to his manner of speaking.
でも、だからなのかもね。相変わらず首の皮一枚の人生を送ってるわ、あなたって。
He tilted his head, clearly confused.
だから、あんたはよっぽどアリス好みの対応をしたのよ。まだ生きてるってそういうこと。
ん？
No matter how hard he tried, he could not grasp what she was getting at. He decided to change the subject to something else.
ところで、ここはどこなんだ？あの子に聞いても教えてくれなかったけど、青崎なら教えてくれるだろ？
ここは三崎町の幽霊屋敷よ。正確には久遠寺邸と言えばいいかしらね。さっきの子、久遠寺アリスの持ち家で私が住んでるところでもある。あの後あなたをここまで持ってきたんだけど覚えてないでしょ？
Something about the way she said that made him feel uncomfortable.
久遠寺っていう名前は聞き覚えがあるような。そうだ、よく商店街でおじさんたちが話してた。なんでも偉いお金持ちだとかなんとか。
それ、アリスの前ではご法度よ。穏便にここで暮らしたいならね。
お？
Confused yet again, Sojiro tilted his head for what seemed like the 100th time that day. And once again, he had heard something to make him feel uneasy.
青崎、君今なんて言った？
しずきくん、私ね、あからさまな嘘を言う人と同じことを何度も言わせる人と察しの悪い人には容赦しないから。そのあたり覚えておいてね。ここで平穏に暮らしたいなら。
Alright guys, I'm going to end the video here for today. Thank you all for watching. When we come back, we're going to continue on in the next one.